on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC, as Alexander the Great lay on his deathbed in Babylon. His closest friends and leaders of his companion cavalry, the Hetarai, gathered around to pay their respects and to learn of Alexander's plans for the succession. This was a difficult position. Alexander was leaving behind a vastly different world than the one he was born into. After just shy of 13 years of kingship and conquest, and only 32 years old, he was leaving this life with no heir and no clear plan for the future. Diadochi writes, "When he, at length, despaired of life, he took off his ring and handed it to Perdiccas. His friends asked him, 'To whom do you leave the kingdom?' And he replied, 'To the strongest.' He added, and these were his last words, that all of his leading friends would stage a vast contest in honour of his funeral. The men gathered round the bed, and a select few others, would go from being the Hetarai, the companions, to become the Diadochi, the successors. But it would take 40 years of bloodshed and the rise and fall of kingdoms for that to take place. Welcome to After Alexander, Wars of the Diadochi, the Partition of Babylon, presented by the research project History. Like and subscribe to follow this journey. The closest Alexander came to designating a successor was to pass his ring to Perdiccas. However, this was insufficient to clearly designate Perdiccas as the chosen heir due to a number of issues. Antipater, the incumbent governor of Europe, was still in control of Macedon and Greece, and although he may have complied with a direct order from Alexander, he was unlikely readily to submit to Perdiccas. Further complicating matters was the issue that Alexander had been planning on removing Antipater from his position, and had sent Craterus with 10,000 veterans to replace him. Craterus was one selected by Alexander for a prominent position of power, and would likely have a strong opinion on who was going to be the leader of the Greco-Macedonian world in the future. But perhaps most perplexing of all was the issue of the pregnant Roxanne, Alexander's wife. If her child turned out to be male, then he would be the most likely heir to the Macedonian throne. Without this potential heir, Perdiccas could have tried to get himself proclaimed king by the army. The timing of it was the most difficult part. If Alexander IV, as he would come to be known, had already been born, then Perdiccas or one of the other companions could position himself as regent on the young boy's behalf. But if, in the end, the baby turned out to be a girl, then whoever was regent would have no valid heir to be regent for. Unsure of what was to come, the day after his death, the key leaders met in the palace to decide who was going to govern the empire. Traditionally, in the selection of a Macedonian king, this was done with the approval of the army, or, where a regent was required for a young king, they too needed to be approved by the soldiers. Because of this, the army needed to be called in, and convinced by whatever proposal the leaders could come up with. In front of the other leaders and the assembled members of the Macedonian army, Perdiccas placed Alexander's crown, ring, and robe on the throne. It was clear to all gathered that Perdiccas at this stage was in the prime position of control. His opening position was that they should appoint an interim ruler while waiting to see the outcome of Roxanne's pregnancy. There were approximately 4 months still to go before the child was due, a time frame far too long for impatient soldiers ready to get home after many years of campaigning. With Perdiccas's position not being immediately accepted, others put forward their proposals. Nearchus, commander of the navy, suggested that an illegitimate son of Alexander, Heracles, should be considered for the kingship. However, he was fiercely rejected on a number of accounts. Firstly, Nearchus was a Greek, something that did not go over at all well in the Macedonian-dominated court. And worse, Heracles was a half Persian. There was no way they wanted the Greco-Macedonian world to come under the control of the power they had just defeated. In this, Nearchus was also being self-promoting. As his Persian wife, Barsinae, was either the stepsister or mother of Heracles, depending on the sources, and if he became king, it would soon be a wildly good promotion for Nearchus. Furthermore, Alexander had never acknowledged Heracles as being his son. There was no chance that the soldiers would allow for this proposal to get up. Next, Ptolemy put forward a novel proposal that there should be a council of the friends and the advisors who should rule together until the birth of Roxanne's child. While this proposal suited the desire of Perdiccas to delay, it also worked to subtly undermine the importance and supremacy of Perdiccas by putting all the high nobles on an equal standing in terms of power and prestige. Ptolemy's proposal found more support than Perdiccas' initial one, but not enough to sway the army. Next, Aristonus, a supporter of Perdiccas, spoke out. He relayed to the assembly that in his mind Perdiccas had already been selected as the new king by Alexander himself. On his deathbed, Alexander had been asked who should replace him, and he had responded, "To the greatest." In Aristonus' view, Alexander handing the ring to Perdiccas was proof enough that it was the wish of the late king for his friend to rule in his place. Unlike the previous proposals, this one was met with near unanimous consent. Probably to everyone's surprise, Perdiccas hesitated, likely not wanting to position himself as a rival to Roxanne's unborn child, and found it better politically to leave the situation unresolved. After waiting a long time, he removed himself from the front and went to stand behind those who had been sitting near him. In the moments following this, Meleager, a general of the infantry, spoke up, arguing that he would revolt rather than have the possibility of being ruled over by someone like Perdiccas. He then said that as all the people, that is, all the soldiers, were the real heirs of the empire, the land they had conquered, they should immediately loot the treasuries themselves. This position caused a near riot to occur. In the midst of this tumult, an unnamed, low-ranking Macedonian put forward the name of Aridaeus, Philip's son and Alexander's half-brother. He had been ignored up until this point, due to him having a mental disability of some kind. It is likely that he was only alive at this point, as Alexander had never seen him as a threat to the throne. However, despite his obvious deficiencies, he was alive, part of the royal line, and present in Babylon. 3 things that would make him a good candidate to be king of the Macedonians in Babylon. It did not take long for Meleager to take advantage of this situation and try to position himself as the champion of Aridaeus, and went and took him and presented him to the assembly as Philip III. This was met with widespread and vocal acceptance from the troops gathered there, but crucially, not from the other nobles. Notably for Meleager, his extreme position and success with the infantry caused the other nobles to close ranks against him and make themselves more willing to compromise with each other against one who could threaten their rank so effectively. Thus the sides were set. Meleager had the support of the infantry, backing Aridaeus to be king, while Leonatus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Aristonus, Python, Seleucus and Eumenes all joined with Perdiccas to try and come up with a solution that suited their wants and their interests better. Following this, the nobles reached a decision amongst themselves, without consulting Meleager or the infantry, to appoint Perdiccas and Leonatus as guardians and regents of Roxanne's unborn child, while Antipater and Craterus could share Europe between themselves, it seeming to be the case that issues back in the homeland were far enough away to be ignored for now. Upon accepting this, the cavalry nobles all vowed that should Roxanne's baby be a boy, they would submit to him and appoint a regent. This decision of the nobles to ignore the wishes of the infantry incensed them, which to a certain extent was quite reasonable, as at the beginning of the meeting it was indicated to them by Perdiccas that it would be for them to approve the decisions of the meeting. And so, under Meleager's command, they revolted against the cavalry. Quintus Curtius Rufus writes, "And Meleager, having put on his cuirass, armed himself as an attendant upon the new king. The phalanx followed his example, clashing their spears against their shields as a sign that they would sate themselves with the blood of those who aspire to a rule to which they have no claim. The opposition of the other nobles was not going to stop Meleager, and with the support of his infantry troops, they were intent on making their opinion fact by force. Perdiccas, and others of the nobles, including Ptolemy, then retreated to the room where the body of Alexander was being kept. Together with about 600 of their loyal cavalry, they barred the doors and hoped to withstand the mob outside. This plan did not go to plan, and despite the efforts of those in the room, Meleager and the mob, numbering in their thousands according to Curtius, broke down the door and began fighting with those loyal to Perdiccas inside. Perdiccas, recognising the futility of fighting on when so severely outnumbered, removed his helmet and appealed to those with him to lay down their arms. Many of the nobles and cavalry at this stage now fled the city, setting up camp on the plains outside. But Perdiccas, who it seems was hoping to both negotiate with the infantry and not instigate a direct civil war between the infantry and cavalry, stayed inside the city. Meanwhile, Meleager, intent on keeping his position, sent a delegation on the authority of Herodias to either capture or kill Perdiccas. However, those sent to fulfill the task were not up to it, and Perdiccas escaped. As a stroke of luck for those loyal to Perdiccas, news of Meleager's attempted assassination of Perdiccas leaked, and dissatisfaction with him began to arise within the ranks of those still in the city. With Meleager unsure of what to do next, for the next 3 days Perdiccas and those with him cut off the grain supply to increase the pressure on those in the city to come to a compromise. Eumenes of Cardia, Alexander's former secretary, remained in the city and negotiated between the parties. The exact nature of the negotiations is unclear. However, Arrian records, and I quote, "Communication passed between them, and at length it was agreed between the infantry, who had already chosen a king, and the cavalry, that Antipater should be general of the forces in Europe, that Craterus should look after the kingdom of Herodias, that Perdiccas should be chillarch of the troops which had been under the command of Hephaestion, which amounted to entrusting him with the care of the whole empire, and that Meleager should be his lieutenant." This elevation of Meleager to nearly the same position as Perdiccas, and the acceptance of Philip III Herodias as the infantry's preferred king under their guidance, no doubt helped greatly in smoothing the negotiation process. In the days following the settlement, a ritual sacrifice and purification of the forces was organised. Following Macedonian tradition, they disemboweled a dog at the far end of a field, and the two sides, on one side the infantry phalanx led by Meleager, and on the other the cavalry, elephants, along with the king and the other nobles. They would walk towards each other until they met in the middle. This was a dangerous position for the infantry in particular to be in, with the cavalry having a significant advantage in the open field. This caused the infantry to freeze with fear. At this point, Herodias, at Perdiccas' instruction, had those blamed for the infantry's rebellion against the nobles pulled out of the ranks and swiftly executed in front of him. Meleager, realising the danger that he was in, fled to the sanctuary of a temple, but the sanctity of the place was entirely insufficient to protect him, and he too was killed. Those loyal to Perdiccas now had an unrivalled position of power in the empire. Returning to Babylon, it was now time to portion out control of the empire. This intense period of negotiation, where in an atmosphere of suspicion, allies were rewarded and rivals appeased. Although the decisions were made in the name of the king, it appears that Perdiccas had the overwhelming voice. Firstly, there was the question of Craterus. Prior to Alexander's death, he had been sent with 10,000 veterans back to Macedon, and had been charged with replacing Antipater as governor of Europe. But on Alexander's death he had stalled in Cilicia, unwilling to potentially start a conflict with Antipater unnecessarily. The decision was made that Antipater and Craterus should share the control of Europe, a condition that neither of them would have likely enjoyed. However, Those gathered in Babylon wouldn't have minded if the two powerful leaders occupied themselves with each other rather than the rest of the empire. So far as the distribution of the satrapies goes, many of them merely had Alexander's appointments reconfirmed. Of the key provinces that changed hands, Ptolemy, at his own request, and one that would prove beneficial, received Egypt, along with parts of Africa and Arabia. This would prove to be fatally bad news for Cleomenes, who had been placed in charge there by Alexander. Laomedon of Mytilene received Syria and Phoenicia on the Mediterranean coast. Leonatus, who at the start of these negotiations was currently co-regent alongside Perdiccas, was demoted and received Hellespontine Phrygia in the northwest corner of Asia Minor, current-day Turkey. Eumenes received both Cappadocia as well as Paphlagonia. Pethion and Atropates received parts of Media each. The other satrapies are less important for the ongoing story. With the threat of Meleager no longer present, Perdiccas could position himself as the sole regent of the empire. There was still the need to organise Alexander's funeral. According to Curtius, it had now been 7 days since he had passed away, and there was as yet to be any signs of decay from him. It seems that Alexander had wanted to be buried at the Siwa oasis in the deserts of Egypt, a location he had gone out of his way to visit after his conquest of Egypt. Chaldeans and Egyptians were brought in to prepare and preserve his body. The final task was to work out what to do with Alexander's plans, which Diodorus records as, and I quote, "It was proposed to build 1,000 warships larger than trimarines in Phoenicia, Syria, Cilicia and Cyprus for a campaign against the Carthaginians and the others who live along the coast of Libya and Iberia, and the adjoining coastal region as far as Sicily. To make a road along the coast of Libya as far as the Pillars of Heracles, and as needed by so great an expedition to construct ports and shipyards as suitable places, to erect 6 most costly temples, each at an expense of 1,500 talents, and, finally, to establish cities and to transplant populations from Asia to Europe, and in the opposite direction from Europe to Asia, in order to bring the largest continents to common unity and to friendly kinship by means of intermarriages and family ties. Also, a tomb for his father Philip was to be constructed to match the greatest of the pyramids of Egypt, buildings which some persons count among the 7 greatest works of man. Although they applauded these outrageous visions, they decided that it was far too extravagant for the current time. With the settlement made, the new satraps departed to their own lands, immediately using the wealth they'd managed to scrape out of Babylon to buy mercenaries and allies alike. The settlement was done. Ahuradeus was king, but Perdiccas was really in control, and well and truly won round 1. But the wars of the Diadochi were only about to begin. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, comments or otherwise, please put them in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and there should be the resources that I used for this episode in the description down below. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.